Well, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, welcome to this Debating Europe lecture by Professor Paul Scheffer. I met him in St. Petersburg when we were talking about the relationship among Russia and the European Union, and since then I thought it was a good idea to invite him to come to the Institute, and this Debating Europe is a nice place to receive you, especially when we are launching our Migration Policy Center, one new unit at the Robert Schuman Center, which is going to enhance our engagement on the issue, very important issue of migration. So, Professor Scheffer, we are very happy that you are going to give this lecture in our Debating Europe discussion series. Let me say something about our speaker. Paul Scheffer is currently Professor of European Studies at Tilburg. European Studies, something in which we are by definition engaged. And for several years he served as professor at the University of Amsterdam. He's the kind of a scholar who at the same time is can I say journalist?
You can say anything.
Like Paul Krugman is also a renowned scholar and a journalist. He's a renowned publicist, and above all, is very well known for being a leading and in many ways controversial thinker on the issues of multiculturalism and immigration. He regularly writes columns and comments for various European newspapers and magazines. He is also, I don't want to hide it, a member of the Dutch Labour Party. Nobody is perfect, but he is not here because of that. He headed even the party's Research Institute for European Policy. But he has a very good academic background. He studied psychology and political science in the Netherlands and in Paris. He is a prominent voice in the academic and public debate on multiculturalism and immigration. He has just recently published a book, Immigrant Nations. It is in the library. It's a very, very good book. It's here even. Exactly. I took out from the library. I got it for many times, for many days in my office. It's good that you can read it as a novel. In his book, Professor Scheffer assesses how immigration is changing our world and received a very successful echo and judgments. Scheffer argues that problems posed by immigration require us to move beyond multiculturalism and that we need to find a new balance between openness and exclusion. It sounds good. A new balance between openness and exclusion. You will tell us how. Today's lecture will be based on these arguments and another book, The Open Society and Its Immigrants, Avoidance, Conflict and Accommodation in Europe. Well, I don't have to repeat that the issue of immigration and how European societies are handling the chances and challenges of immigration are a core issue for our European societies. The UI and the Robert Schuman Center are doing ever more research on this important issue. We have launched, Professor Scheffer, this new Migration Policy Center. You have had the opportunity of knowing many of our researchers and professors working on this issue, and I hope that we will have the opportunity of working together and maybe you can widespread the result of our researches. Before passing the floor to our speaker, a short comment on the format of these Debating Europe lectures, which little by little are being something to which we are used to in the Institute. Professor will speak for around 30 minutes. It will be followed by comments from Professor Baubock, who is an expert on the topic. He will moderate the following discussion, and there we'll have a drink in the upper loggia in order to make you jealous about our splendid setting here in Firenze. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you some ideas about immigration in Europe. I would like to thank Josep Borrell for the invitation, Fabian Breuer and Sarah St. John for organizing it and keeping up a busy email conversation, and Rainer Baubeck for making some time in a haunting schedule of interviews, as I understood. So, without further ado, I've tried to squeeze my argument into 7, hopefully, straightforward propositions. The first one is that post-war immigration in Europe is largely the history of unintended consequences, which is often mistaken by many as saying that migration is part of globalization, and perhaps the most visible aspect of globalization is beyond political intervention, beyond parliamentary debate, because in essence, the world we live in is a world that is becoming more and more borderless. I think the two propositions are quite different, because if you look at main migration flows in post-war Europe, there is hardly any without political intervention. Let's take, for example, the guest workers who came and for many overstayed their stay and became immigrants. Without the role of national governments, the flow of guest workers would not have been as it was. Governments have been very instrumental. If we look at post-colonial migration, it's evident that political decision-making has been quite important. If we look now in our time at the flows of migrants coming from Eastern Europe, it has everything to do with the political decision to enlarge the European Union and to create a zone of free flows of persons. So when you look at most substantial immigration flows, political decisions either to induce people to leave their country or the opposite, to ask people, to invite them to become part of society, have been influenced by political decisions. But at the same time, I contend that these political decisions have had many unintended consequences. And that so there was never a clear political plan, a long-term strategy in Europe with regard to migration. So yes, it is a story of unintended consequences. Let me give you one example. To read to you a quote of a young French member of parliament. We speak now 1958. This should be seen in the context of post-colonial or colonial relations. And the young French parliamentarian said the following during a debate. What should be said of the Algerians is not that they have need of France, but that France has need of them. I contend that there is nothing in the religion of Islam that from a moral point of view prevents a believing or practicing Muslim from becoming a full French citizen. I conclude, offer the Muslims of Algeria entry and integration into a dynamic France. Now, who said these interesting and inviting words? Jean-Marie Le Pen, the leader of the Front National, who later turned, of course, in the fiercest critics to be the fiercest critic of his own words, so to say. But that illustrates the unintended consequence of a lot of migration, that those who favored continuing colonial relations were the ones in France and Britain to be the most open to migration, because it was seen as continuing the colonial relation. So that is one example, but I could cite many others. My second proposition is that in the study of immigration, I think too much emphasis is given to the life stories of immigrants and not enough emphasis is given to the position of native populations. For me, the story of migration is a story of the interaction between natives and newcomers, to put it in a very short phrase. And I would qualify this interaction not driven by what is often said, that migration should be seen as an enrichment of societies, but I think that the social dynamic at work and the relation between newcomers and natives is more driven by a shared sense of loss. There is where it begins, with a sense of losing a world that was known to migrants and a world that was known to native populations. Without this sense of loss, I don't think we really understand the history of migration. To give a few examples of this loss and why I think it's important to look at migration from that angle. And I'm not suggesting that in a longer generational perspective, migration cannot be an enrichment. I will come back to that later. But I think the starting point of the dynamic that unfolds when substantial groups of migrants enter a society is a sense of loss. From the point of view of migrants, it's quite obvious that migration means, in terms of Oscar Handlin, to be uprooted, to lose a world that was known to you, to find a place in a society that is in many ways unknown, difficult to fathom, difficult to understand. So when a woman from the Moroccan community in the Netherlands tells me, I'm afraid I'm losing my children to this society, I think those kind of sentences should be taken very seriously, because her sense of losing her children, of course, means that, first of all, as a mother, she wants her children to succeed in Dutch society or French or German society, but at the same time, she has the feeling that if her child succeeds, that the distance between her and her children becomes perhaps too large. And she doubts in many ways the customs and traditions of this society and whether it's a good idea to really become part of it. That sense of loss, that's what I'm talking about. Or, to give a different example related to it, is what Park of the Chicago School of Sociology already for 100 years described as a demoralization of the immigrant. That migration means losing a position in an established community, finding yourself in a larger urban area, and that often the loss of status that migration entails make it difficult for parents, more specifically for fathers, to claim their position in families. So what is typical for many stories of migration is the tension between children and parents, the generational gap. And it has a lot to do with the loss of status. Or, to give the last example, it means something quite existential, I think, to find yourself suddenly in another language and to try to find a way in a different language, a language with all the emotional and historical nuances. And it's not easy to master a new language and to lose gradually the ability to speak the language that you brought with you. So I think if we want to understand why many migrants, and why this story is so often told, that migrants cling tenaciously to supposed traditions, that is something to do with this loss that I try to describe with some anecdotal evidence. If you look at Dutch migrants in Australia, and you visit their homes, and they left in the 50s, in the 60s, you sort of enter a time machine, and they speak a very strange sort of Dutch that 50 years ago was common in the Netherlands, but no longer is spoken in that way. And it's a sort of museum of the Netherlands as it used to be. And I think that is typical for many migration stories that you would find among first-generation migrants, customs, traditions, a language, clinging to those traditions, perhaps as a reaction to the feeling that the world that was known is lost. And I think there is a sense of loss also on part of the native population. If we look at the demographic realities, cities like Amsterdam, Malmö, Birmingham, Stuttgart, Marseille, now almost half of the populations are migrant families. And those who were living in the areas where migrants first settled, I think they witness also a sense of losing a world that was known to them. Their neighborhoods are changing, the houses of worship are changing, the sports clubs are changing, the schools are changing. And I see, if I try to understand with different words than xenophobia or racism, words that are most often used in describing the reaction of natives to large-scale immigration, I think we understand more by using subtle words like a sense of loss of a world that was known, and also as a mirror image almost of the migrants clinging to traditions that are evaporating, that are slowly, or perhaps less than slowly, changing. In a sense, I think we need different words to understand and describe and to register the reactions of natives in what are becoming immigrant societies and immigrant cities. I was inspired by many writings from the 50s and earlier, but also by the speech of Barack Obama, when he tried to say something meaningful about the resentment of the white residents of America. He said, 3 years ago, most working and middle-class white Americans don't feel that they have been particularly privileged by their race. They are anxious about their futures and feel their dreams slipping away. When they're told that their fears about crime in urban neighborhoods are somehow prejudiced, resentment built over time. So, for example, when in Germany the discussion erupted about whether the separation of state and church wouldn't mean, in the end, removing symbols of Christian belief from public schoolrooms, I think the reaction could be understood by many Germans as we're losing the symbols of the world that was known to us. I think in the end it is a real loss, in the sense that you cannot continue to live up to the criterion of the separation of state and church and still say we have our own Christian symbolism in the public school. We can debate about it, but I think a sense of loss is what is shared by newcomers and natives, and that the phrase immigration is an enrichment for us all is in the longer term a relevant way of looking at it. But if we want to understand the starting point, the social dynamic that unfolds in immigrant societies, I think we should choose a different angle. My third proposition is that the way societies, from both points of view of natives and newcomers, react to the change that is brought with migration unfolds in a dialectic of avoidance, conflict, and accommodation. You could say, perhaps you could recognize in that dialectic of avoidance, conflict, and accommodation that I will elaborate a little bit further later on, you could recognize the idea of Hirschman of exit, voice, and loyalty. You could perhaps recognize also that there are three fundamental ways to react to social change: withdrawal, conflict, or acceptance. And I think that the story of migration, if I read the American experiences and try to understand also European experiences, that you often recognize this story of avoidance, conflict, and accommodation that is at work. And that in itself is, I think, a hopeful way of looking at migration, because I haven't found much examples of migrant communities that divide societies in the longer run. And it's perhaps also a more realistic assessment in the sense that avoidance, read segregation, and conflict are part of all major migration stories. I haven't found much examples of major migration, for example, the Italians coming to America, or the Italians coming to France, or the Polish migrants, or the Mexicans in our time. I could cite many, many examples where you could also see that American and European experience have much more in common than is often understood, but where you would recognize some of this pattern. Of course, if you would look in detail to specific communities in specific areas, specific times, you would of course not be able to find this neat presentation, but I think it has some relevance in understanding the patterns of integration, avoidance, conflict, and accommodation. You could perhaps see in it also the dialectic of 3 generations, of course the most classic and well-known paradigm in immigration research, where you would say the first generation is a generation where avoidance is perhaps the strongest present. The second generation, the children who are born in the country of arrival, is perhaps more prone to conflict, whereas the third generation symbolizes and embodies acceptance. Of course, we should move beyond this schema, and I don't think it applies to every situation, but perhaps it's helpful. Let me then say something about these 3 phases. Segregation. I think every substantial migration entails forms of segregation. The levels of segregation in America and Europe are not that different. It's always opposed to each other, but I've worked for the last 8 years in the Department of Social Geography, and they're good at one thing, well, more things, but specifically one thing, the segregation index, and they've computed it. And if you look at the levels of segregation in American cities, when you look at migrant communities, I'm not talking about the African American experience, because that's not a story of migration, but of slavery and forced segregation. Still very high levels of segregation in cities like Chicago, Boston, or New York. But if you leave that aside and look at migrant communities, you would find roughly comparable, in America somewhat higher, but not dramatically different from most European cities, the levels of segregation. So, but the approach in America of segregation is quite different from Europe. In America, it's much more seen as a choice of migrant communities, whereas in Europe, it's more seen as a choice of the native populations, white flight, which forces segregation upon migrant communities. To quote the American geographer, Paul Knox, he says, "The spatial segregation of different communities helps to minimize conflict between social groups, while facilitating a greater degree of social control and endowing specific social groups with a more cohesive political voice." So overall, he portrays it, like many others, as first of all a choice of migrant communities to seek spatial concentration, to build up ethnic economies, to have more of a community life in a specific neighborhood. Whereas in European research, you would quite often find that segregation is more seen as forced upon migrant communities by the avoidance of native populations. Aside from this explanation of segregation, I think that segregation is a spatial expression of a culture of avoidance. I think you would hardly find major migrant flows without encountering forms of avoidance by the native populations, either in the form of white flight or other forms of segregation, and you would typically find forms of avoidance in major migrant communities. Then, if I look at what follows in most migration stories, is that there always comes a moment when segregation breaks down, when it is no longer a way to avoid conflict, whereas it functions in many ways as a way to avoid conflict. I've just compared Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and Amsterdam is a more pacified city with less conflict around migration, but segregation is on the rise in Amsterdam, whereas Rotterdam is a city where you find a lot of conflict around migration, but it's also the city where segregation has declined in the last 15 years. So perhaps there's a relation. But sooner or later, in cities where half of the population are migrant families, I think segregation breaks down. It's not, especially when you see the generational, when you have a generational perspective, it's not a long-term situation. Of course, you have small groups that can maintain for a long time a segregated life, often you find segregation outside of urban areas, but to have a sizable migrant community with segregation as a long-term strategy, I don't think I have found one example of that could be a successful strategy. So sooner or later, people start to touch each other in neighborhoods, in schools, in the workplace. And my reading of migration history, is that the contact often leads to conflict. But I see conflict as a link between avoidance and accommodation. I don't see conflict as a form of disintegration. I see it as a symbol of integration, of a story of integration. So there I try to analyze it in the context of conflict sociology, where conflict is seen as part of social renewal, of social change. And to quote Simmel, who was of course the most important figure in this tradition, he says, "Our opposition," speaking about conflict, "make us feel that we are not completely victims of circumstances. It allows us to prove our strength consciously, and only thus gives vitality and reciprocity to conditions from which, without such corrective, we would withdraw at any cost." So, withdrawal as a strategy, but as a strategy that is not viable in the long run, and especially not an option for the second generation, for the children who are born in the country of arrival, and don't have, I think, the same distance towards the receiving society as the parents have. Especially for the children, you would find they have a different attitude towards the receiving society. I read the conflicts that you would find in all major migration history as a sign of integration, as a sign of a social dynamic at work. And you see, especially if you look at the American, but also at the European examples, you would see social forms of conflict, cultural aspects of conflict. Let me very briefly mention two. For example, the cultural conflict in America surrounding the arrival of Catholic immigrants from Ireland and Poland and Italy in Protestant America in the midst of the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. There are so many examples of rather rough conflict in America. And you could tell the same, of course, in our time, and I see many parallels there with the arrival of Muslim migrants in societies where the Islam doesn't have much of a tradition, or societies that have become largely secularized. But I don't see these conflicts on the whole, when we speak about non-violent conflict, I don't see them as the failure of integration. I see them as integration ongoing, and I will try to, in my summary, try to bring that more to the point. Perhaps also with the second generation, you could say that, especially in Europe, where the myth of return was quite strong, that the second generation also embodies the irreversibility of migration. From the point of view of migrants, many have told me that with children, the acknowledgement came, we're here to stay, but also from the point of view of the native populations, who suddenly acknowledged that the myth of return and the idea that migration was somehow temporary was not a realistic assessment any longer. There are not only cultural forms of conflict, but I think there's also a social dimension, and both have their own rationality, so to say. So when Zollberg, in his History of American Migration, writes about the eternal dialectic, of course, one should treat it with a bit of caution, words like eternal and dialectic as well. But still, when he says, you know, every major migration in America provoked resistance, provoked mobilization of migrants, and the resistance and the mobilization are part of an ongoing integration. But there is also a rationality there at work that the social conflicts surrounding migration, especially on the lower rungs of the labor market, I think should not be ignored or deemed only as a form of prejudice. I think there are real social conflicts there. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to explain why the labor unions throughout the history of migration have always been very ambivalent about migration. If it would be so clear that migration would be in the benefit of all and would not be also a form of redistribution in a population, then it would be very difficult to understand why all these hesitations and ambivalences also among trade unions, and especially, of course, in our era of the welfare state, would be so strong. So I think there's a social dimension and a cultural dimension to the conflicts we see surrounding most migration. Then to finish with some remarks about accommodation. I think that, as I said, that most accommodation, most migration leads to forms of accommodation sooner or later. So that would be my fifth and last proposition. So the fourth one was that conflict is a sign of integration. My fifth and last proposition would be that accommodation requires self-reflection of a society. And that is, in my view, the real enrichment of migration, that it forces migrants over generations into reflecting upon the meaning and the value of traditions they brought with them, and it forces the receiving society into reflection about institutions, freedoms, traditions. And I think that self-reflection, which we see at work in many migrant histories, is the most fundamental thing to say about the accommodation at work. It's in the end, I think, clear that when a society expects immigrants to see themselves as citizens, the question always returns, but what does it mean to be a citizen? Integration into what, actually? And the embarrassment surrounding a lot of discussions in our time about immigration is, I think, an embarrassment in answering the question, integration into what, actually? So I've seen in my own country, the Netherlands, many interesting discussions where the government says to immigrants, you should know something about the Constitution. And then sooner or later, the embarrassing question returns, what do you know about the Constitution yourself? And of course, most Dutch citizens don't have a clue, or a very vague understanding. And then, of course, the next question is it so important to know anything about the Constitution? Or is it irrelevant to the prospect of integration? So in the end, I think that reciprocity is for me the key to the process of integration. That it forces a society not to say to immigrants, you should integrate into what we are, but to see integration as measuring yourself as in a society against norms of equal treatment, for example, or norms of religious freedom. So for me, in the end, integration is about measuring a society against its own normative aspirations of equal treatment. And then, of course, it becomes a somewhat different perspective of accommodation. And I think throughout the history of migration, we can observe that it has worked that way, that in the end, migration forces a society to enlarge the idea it has of itself and of what it means to be a citizen. So the whole idea of being an American was, in the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century, exclusively Protestant, etc. And gradually, through different stages of migration, you can see that it's gradually enlarged, gradually became more inclusive. So the conflict surrounding each wave of immigration, in the end, shouldn't be seen as the failure of accommodation, but as a search for a form of accommodation. I think that if we look at Europe today, we see that we move away from an emphasis on diversity and multiculturalism to an emphasis on citizenship. The reciprocity that is implied there is hard to escape in the end. And that is for me the most productive way to look at post-war immigration. To conclude, this accommodation is about the economics of migration. And there, I think we can learn a lot about the misfit of the welfare state and mass migration. I think to summarize it in one sentence, I think the economics of migration are not in order. If I look at a society like the Netherlands, I can see, not only in the first generation, but also in the second generation, too many who are not participating in the labor market. And that is something to do with the workings of the welfare state. It's no coincidence that classic countries of immigration have a far less developed welfare state. It has nothing to do with questions of guilt and blame, but simply to observe that the workings of the welfare state in combination with substantial migration, especially of low-skilled migrants, have turned the most enterprising and risk-prone part of our populations into the most dependent part of the population, which is, I think, in three senses not good. First of all, for those involved. Secondly, for the children who are born in those families and in neighborhoods where too few are at work. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, it has been disastrous for the acceptance of migration as part of our future in Europe. I think that many people would like to see the economic rationality of migration improved because it is fundamental for the acceptance of migration. It's not only about the economics of migration, but it's also about the symbolism of migration societies, of immigrant nations. If we typify America as an immigrant nation, it's always the emphasis on the diversity, whereas, of course, in the equation, it's also an immigrant nation. And what is the nation there? E pluribus unum. What is the unum? It's always America's characterized as, a high degree of diversity, but the interesting thing is, of course, what are the symbols and the way of dealing with diversity? What is the search of what you need to have in common to be able to live with all those different nationalities, cultures in larger urban areas? I think that is a question that revolves around the symbolism of immigrant nations, and I think we don't have our symbolism in order as well in most European societies. Just to give a few examples, and then I really stop there. I don't think we should see this after the end of multiculturalism in a way, and Cameron and Sarkozy and Merkel declaring multiculturalism has failed and then turning into a discourse on national identity. I don't believe in that at all. I think that the discussions about Britishness or national identity in France have proved exactly that it produces more distrust to try to have a discourse, in a political sense on national identity. But what you could do in a more normative sense is emphasizing that the freedoms, for example, the freedom of religion, entails a sense of reciprocity that goes beyond the law. To put it more clearly, if you speak about freedom of religion, of course, people can reject the reciprocity that tells you that the right of religious freedom goes hand in hand with the responsibility to defend the same right for people with other religions or no religions. That sense of reciprocity is not enshrined in the law in the sense that you cannot force people to accept others. All orthodoxy is very much about claiming acceptance but not giving acceptance to others, to reject that sense of reciprocity. But that is the paradox, I think, of an open society, that minorities can always, and minorities can be fundamentalists from Christian persuasion or of a secular persuasion or a Muslim tradition. So I'm not speaking about specific groups. I'm saying that minorities in an open society can reject the reciprocity on which an open society is built. But if majorities or large groups in societies or urban areas do that, then we have a serious problem in an open society. And so I think we lack the normative engagement in our societies to defend the reciprocity that is entailed in the freedom of speech and the freedom of religion. And that is, for me, one of the explanations why we see the rise of populist parties that claim freedoms that they reject for others, or that we see in some migrant communities forms of claiming a right to exercise a religious freedom without accepting the responsibility to defend those rights for others. We feel also, in a ritual sense, I think we need to reflect more on the rituals of naturalization, not to exclude, but to include people, not only in a sense of legalities, to think about what are the conditions of naturalization, but also to learn something from classic immigration societies where you have all kinds of rituals, balancing the diversity, balancing the huge diversity. City of Amsterdam, very small, 180 different nationalities live there. So to balance that, we need to think more about rituals. I end with one anecdote, and that is that I was in the Bijlmermeer, a suburb of Amsterdam, speaking to people from the Surinamese community, and somebody stood up and said very angrily to me, "Nobody talks about us anymore." And the background was that in the Netherlands now a lot of discussions about the Moroccan, Turkish communities. And in fact, nobody speaks about the Surinamese communities anymore. Those are the most, in Canadian terms, the most visible migrants. I don't like the terminology, but all our terminologies are a bit rusty. But the Canadians like to speak about visible minorities. Well, the Surinamese are, in that sense, the most visible minority. Nobody speaks about them anymore. 30 years ago, they were a bone of contention. A lot of conflicts around the Surinamese community. Not anymore. So, in that one sentence, "nobody speaks about it anymore," summarizes what took me 400 pages to describe, this story of avoidance spilling over into conflict, spilling over into forms of accommodation. Thank you very much.
This won't be an easy task because I was hoping I would hear more things that I can disagree with very strongly to get a real debate. I've actually not fully read, but browsed fairly extensively through Paul's book. And I think it's definitely worth reading because it comes in a way after 10 or even 12 years, 10 or 12 years after the essay that Paul became famous for, which is the multicultural drama, that opened critical self-reflection on Dutch multiculturalism. I assume that Paul, as many other pioneers, feels that he might have been overtaken and even abused by others who have jumped on this bandwagon and steered it in quite different directions. So it's very important to go back and to have a statement that is as balanced and as comprehensive as this book. And just listening to him, you will have got the main message, which is that, yes, European states have developed into immigrant nations, and what they need to do is they need to be not just aware about this fact, but they must be self-reflexive on both sides, the newcomers and the natives, because that's the only way that going through the cycle of avoidance, conflict, and accommodation, they can come up with something that they might be able to share. And let me also mention that the idea of what they can share is one that we share too. This is all about citizenship. It's not, just toleration across cultural differences. It's not just economic opportunities. There must be some idea that we have a common framework of liberties, of equality, at least a promise of equality of opportunities, and some common idea of belonging to democratic institutions. And this is what we ought to be able to agree upon in spite of all our different beliefs and traditions and origins. That's the only hope we have, and it's a vague hope of finding something that could be called cohesion within democratic societies. So on all of this we agree. Now I have 3 pages of notes on Paul's book that it doesn't make sense to go back to them after hearing his 7 propositions. I will just make ad hoc comments in a way on these propositions, and maybe not on all of them, because on some of them I just agree. First one was just to remind you that the history of post-war immigration in Europe is a history of unintended consequences of political choices or political histories, if you include colonialism in this. And that is very true. It's not just an externally imposed fate of globalization. It's part of our history because we've made that history too in various ways. But by saying it's a history of unintended consequences, you might still wonder what that implies for the stances and the policies that you ought to adopt now. And I would say, well, if it's unintended, it still ought to be seen as irreversible, just as if it were a destiny that was in a way developed without our own doing. So the recognition of irreversibility is independent of acknowledging that there were policy choices that came into this. But at the same time, I think, and that's the good message, the policy choices are still there now. So there is something to be done in finding the right responses. It's not just the inevitable force of globalization and neoliberal market economies that will determine what happens with immigrants. It's, again, our choices, although we might not have been completely conscious of what we do when starting off immigration. Now we can make choices how that have to do with immigrant integration. Secondly, your second proposition was there is too much emphasis on the immigration life stories, the immigrants' life stories, too little on the too little awareness about the sense of loss that is felt both by the immigrants and by the natives. And here again, it's hard to disagree, but what occurred to me just listening to you is a quote by Hannah Arendt that I like very much, which is that every generation experiences a sense of not just loss, but being invaded by new coming generations, the next ones. That is fairly independent of migration. Modernity is a history of rapid change where each generation feels it loses something because the next generation creates something that is no longer recognized by the previous ones as their traditions. And if you see that as something that societies that are not cold in Levi-Straussian terms, but hot societies, because they accelerate this intergenerational change, have as an intrinsic feature, then what migration does is, in a way, it again accelerates that kind of change, and therefore also the sense of loss that comes with it. But that's something, again, you have to acknowledge and even to embrace in order to be able to cope with it. So the answer to the sense of loss cannot be to reassure them not so much has changed. But it must be also, and I think there, again, we agree, we must find the institutions that will allow for some kind of perceived intergenerational continuity with the things that really count, such as democracy, the political institutions, etc. And that's the challenge, and I have no very good answer to this. If you see that societies become not just, there's not just the intergenerational turnover, but there's mobility across political borders, then the challenge becomes much greater to make each generation aware that there is a next generation that is not just made up of their own children, right? That will inherit the institutions of this society. And the institutions have to be made in a way that accommodates that change as well, but still be perceived as their institutions. So the sense of control that citizens ought to have in democracy over their political institutions of government needs to be fostered, preserved, promoted in order to, as a response to the sense of loss that happens and is accelerated, but not just caused by migration. Third proposition was about this nice trinity or three stages of avoidance, conflict, and accommodation, or exit, voice, and loyalty. And there, it occurred to me there's something missing there. And what's missing there is not a fourth stage, but it's too much a unilinear story. It's still too much a story about it ends up in accommodation of settled immigrants? Well, to some degree, it never gets beyond the first stage of exit in the sense of mobility. There, alongside migration that leads to settlement, we have increasing volumes of mobile populations that never settle for good. They return to their countries of origin, they move on to third countries. There is a highly mobile population that is, again, actively created by globalizing market opportunities. And the answer might be even a bigger challenge, because we cannot refer to the old histories, how Americans tell themselves their own stories about the building of the American nation. Well, they've come from faraway places, they've been very different, we didn't like them, but eventually through fighting out the conflicts we integrated them and they became fully Americans. That's true, but even for the big wave of European migrants across the Atlantic, we know that 1/3 of them returned, didn't stay for good. And these volumes are probably in proportion increasing now compared to those who just settle and stay for good, and then there are next generations and they go through all the conflicts that you mentioned. So we ought to broaden our framework for thinking about the harder question of how to integrate mobile populations and not just settled immigrants, which might be paradoxically, as you say, in some way it makes the problem easier because there is constant avoidance between mobile populations and settled populations. But in other ways, it makes the problem much harder because it's much more difficult to build, for example, solidarity in a welfare state between mobile populations and stable sedentary populations. And we ought to distinguish between these problems, second and third generations that experience discrimination and alienation and exclusion, but obviously belong to that society and therefore you can appeal to equality among citizens, versus the mobile Europeans that are not seen as belonging, but they have all the rights, including the welfare rights. And the resentment that this breeds is of a very different kind, but it might be even more difficult to address than the resentment towards the second and third generations of immigrant origin. That's a part of the story that I find missing in your book. And it's very much the European story. Why that? Because Europe is, in one way, it's different from America in the sense that it has created, it's a dual problem of integration. It's a problem of simultaneous integration of migratory flows and integration of nation states into a supranational union, that the citizenship of which is essentially about freedom of movement and mobility. And handling these two aspects simultaneously makes Europe, I think, in a way unique, because you cannot refer back to the American solution for that problem. Of course, America was a huge space of internal freedom of movement for the settling population, but it was resolved through imagining that we are building a nation. And that's not possible in Europe because you have the nations. And the nations insist that they are distinct and they have their languages and they want official recognition for all of this, and they get it in the European treaties. So what you need to build instead in Europe is some kind of citizenship that goes without national identities at the level of the European citizenship and supports freedom of movement and the right of mobile populations, and finds it very difficult to address the resentment of the stable majority of European citizens that don't see the benefits that they get from European citizenship because they are not joining this club of their highly mobile populations, both at the lower end of the skill scale and the high end of the skill scale. I have many more comments, but I think I'd better stop it here because that might be the most important thing I have to say. We have to imagine that there is actually something new that is going on in Europe that has to do with the challenge of building these institutions beyond the nation state that can cope with a space of free movement internally and of movement from that has external sources. And that ought to be seen as a new challenge, and we can't go back to the old answers in many ways.
Definitely not the one who would suggest otherwise. No, no, definitely.
That's a debating thing, so debate.
I think perhaps it's not a good idea if I respond too long, because I would be really interested to hear other comments, but what I'd like to emphasize is the second proposition. I mean, do you think there is a need within the framework of immigration studies or studies about immigration societies to have a more developed and differentiated perspective on native populations and that interaction? Because I really think that when this perspective is spoken about, it's always in the context of prejudice, discrimination, xenophobia. And I would like to postpone those words as long as possible. Not because there is no xenophobia, yes, there is xenophobia. Not because there is no prejudice, yes, there is prejudice, also within migrant communities. But because I think we need more subtle words to describe the whole range of experiences of the native populations, because otherwise we cannot understand the interaction that is central to the development I try to portray. Your last point, I think, is very valid. I have some comments on it in my book about this intersection of European integration and the integration within the nation states with regard to immigrant populations. That's definitely a very valid comment. But as long as there is no lived sense of European citizenship, I still think that the main reference for migrants is also the nation state, the national languages, the national labor markets, etc. So the mobility is still, I think, very much for those who don't return, because that's a very specific proposition. But for those who remain, I still think that the national framework, the national welfare state, the national curriculum, the educational system, the language, etc., it still is in Europe mainly an affair of nation states. But I do think that it would be easier if there would be a substantial idea of European citizenship, because the offer of becoming, to a proud Ottoman, to become a Dane is a very different idea than to offer the same proud Ottoman to become a European citizen. Of course, that is a much wider perspective that offers much more in many ways. But I still think we are, from that reality, we're still quite far removed. I'll leave it there for a moment.
Briefly, and be sure to push the button of the microphone before you speak. Shushanik.
Professor Scheffer, thank you for your interesting presentation, and I have a few questions, but given that there are many questions, audience, I'll ask you just one. Your main emphasis is on the responsibility of both migrants and natives to integrate in the sending society. So I think the story you are telling is a society, in the receiving society, I'm sorry. So basically, the story you are telling is the story of a recipient country. But then, even though you are giving too much agency to both migrants and natives, I think there are some aspects that are, I'm not sure I would know how you would answer or explain. For example, how would you then explain the varying degree of integration of different migrant communities in the same receiving state? So, for example, we know that different ethnic groups concentrate in certain sectors of the society, given, let's say, they do certain types of jobs in the same society. So I don't think it's an individual decision as much as a structural story that is behind in the same receiving state. So how would you explain it?
Yeah, thank you very much. So, Philippe Fag from the Migration Policy Center. Thank you to both of you, to the presenter and the discussant. That was excellent. So I have three questions, one for each of your points. The first is on unintended consequences of political decisions. One of the big political decisions of the post-war period was made in 1973-74, when most European states closed the border to labor migration, but left open the border to family reunification. What would have been another possibility? Closing the border to family reunion or leaving the border open to labor migration? So that is my question number one. Question number two, you insisted on the sense of loss, and you said for individuals, and Rainer added maybe for generations. Do you think that there could be also a sense of enrichment of a society through migration? My question number three is about your three steps, avoidance, conflict, and accommodation. But as Rainer put it, at the end we still have these two communities, the new ones and the old one, the migrants and the natives. But don't you think that with the passing of time, the migrant origin will just vanish, and then we will have one new population, one new society out of several old populations and societies? Thank you.
Netherlands itself is a spectacular example of that, broken up several times. And I was also wondering when you started to talk about religious freedom, because at some point, as if I understood you properly, you sort of said, yes, that requires reciprocity. Well, it only requires reciprocity if you believe in a sort of liberal notion of religion. And perhaps one of the fundamental problems of political thought in our century is that we do not have addressed the roots of religious freedom, the philosophical roots of religious freedom properly. Classically in the Netherlands, you have already two competing versions. You have the versions of Grotius and Spinoza, which says, yes, everybody should be free to think and say what they want, but all in one church, and preferably in the church that we control, right? Which is a wonderful form of toleration, as long as you belong to that church. If you don't belong to that church, you have a problem with them. The other classical version, also developed in the Netherlands in the 1680s by people like Locke and Limburg, is to say, no, religion and politics are completely separate. That's how God has ordered it. Liberals have taken that over, except that God has gone away. And if God hasn't ordered it, it isn't quite clear who has ordered it. Right? So you have a problem there in grounding your religious freedom, especially if you're confronted with groups that have neither read Locke, Grotius, Spinoza or Limburg, or have read them and think it's all rubbish. So I wonder whether how religion and religious freedom actually fit into that story, whether that isn't the new element, or rather the old element that has come back. And then it's rather surprising that a country like the Netherlands, that was born in religious conflict, is so bad at coping with it.
If I take your argument right and I rephrase it, I think you state that immigrants perform some sort of civic maieutic, so helping natives and migrants to become aware of a citizenship and learn some sort of citizenship grammar. Now, I'm an empiricist, and I try to apply this idea to the population I've been studying in the past decade, which is a population that lies exactly what you call the intersection of European integration and migration, that is intra-European migrants, both Western and Eastern, that is the Brits, the Germans, and the Poles and the Romanians that settle within the EU, having EU citizenship. Now, I just finished an empirical survey of this population in Southern Europe, France, Spain, Italy, and Greece, and I'm looking at this data. And what I see is that these people don't care much about European citizenship. I mean, they don't vote in the European Parliament. They know little about their rights. They have different interests and different fortune in their life. So I'm a bit puzzled. This reflexivity that you expect to emerge out of a migration process doesn't emerge exactly where it should be higher. How do you make sense of this kind of paradox?
Thank you. I was also interested by your argument about the shared feelings between the natives and the immigrant populations, which I found very interesting and very productive in terms of tolerance, try to understand what these populations share. However, leaving aside the sectors of the native populations that have been, in a way, hit a little bit more by immigrants. This is the uneducated, poor native populations. Don't you consider a little bit some sort of an euphemism to compare the feeling of loss that one person in need, which can be a refugee, asylum seeker, undocumented immigrant, don't you consider to be some sort of an euphemism to compare it with the share of loss that probably a native can feel when they go out of their house and see a minaret or something like that? Thanks.
Sergo Marnashvili, Migration Policy Center. I have a problem with the notion of conflict and the role of conflict between these two elements. I understand your point of view, and I think you are a adherent of Karl Popper's philosophy, if I really understand the title of your book. But at the same time, the conflict can be good in the sense of Popperian philosophy, meaning that two arguments are clashing with each other. But in the society where you have Marine Le Pen, for example, and people adhering Sharia traditions, wouldn't it lead to a Popperian paradox of tolerance, where you allow just people to speak about everything, but it leads to nothing and has unintended consequences, as we have in many European countries? Thank you.
Academics like to generalize. That's what we do. But it's not always so easy, I think. And I wonder whether the issues in Europe are at all similar to those which exist in the US, where I live. I live in a bilingual city, Los Angeles, in which at least half of the immigrants are there illegally, without question. At the same time, they bring a sense of vitality and vigor to the city which would not exist without them, and which cities without immigrants seem very dull and drab indeed. We don't, I think, have the same issues that exist in Europe, largely because so many of the Hispanic immigrants are doing their best they possibly can to fit in with a larger society. And we have an Hispanic mayor, which really makes things better for our city.
The advantage of having so many questions is it's like a menu in a restaurant. You can pick and choose, right?
Yes, but once you ordered,
you're stuck.
You're stuck with it. And let's start in Los Angeles. I mean, this is a huge question, but if I look at, I was speaking about US immigration history, and I find many interesting parallels, you know, between what happened to the immigration from Italy, Ireland, and so forth. That's the first remark. Secondly, I think the discussion about the Mexican immigrants, especially, is not easy in the United States. I've observed that the same contentions and the same worries about protecting the border that we have in the south of Europe can be found in the south of the United States with rather atrocious consequences, if I may say so. I've seen many English first movements in the United States trying to enshrine English in the Constitution. So there is a sensitivity about language. So I think there are more parallels to be found, and immigration, and especially the inability in the United States to really find an answer to the presence of so many millions, 13 million illegal immigrants, where President Obama still has not found the words nor the legislative activity because he's not convinced that he can find the majority to push forward solutions in that field. I think it is productive, despite all the obvious differences that we know there are, to seek more what are the overlapping realities of immigration in America and the United States. And I add one more thing, that if you look at research on public opinion, and then I'm not talking about Los Angeles or New York or Chicago, but overall attitudes to immigration in Europe and America are not that different, either vis-à-vis illegal immigration or vis-à-vis legal immigration. So there's never been, since '47, a majority of Americans saying that more immigration was needed. On the contrary, there have been quite substantial groups throughout the post-war history of the United States who were in favor of restriction, or at least not in augmenting migration. So I think the same resistance and same ambivalences can be found throughout the United States. And of course, New York and Los Angeles are different, but I think when you take America as a whole, there are 6 states where immigration is concentrated with regard to the first generation. And I note that the demographic realities of America are not that different from Europe. 13% first generation in America, somewhat more than 11% in Western Europe. It's not that different anymore. So in that sense, I think there are a lot of ways in which the American experience can be, in a productive way, be compared to European experiences. Now, conflict. Marine Le Pen, is she helpful? Is she an example of the conflict I was speaking about? Is populism? At least one could say that perhaps the way the political movements in the center of our societies have dealt with the question of immigration has helped to foster populist reactions, because I think there was not an honest discourse on benefits and costs of immigration. So I think a more honest and balanced approach where you say, yes, migration brings a lot of benefits, but also entails costs. You know, it was more seen as an ideal of a multicultural society without further qualifications. And I think that the parties of the center, neither when it comes to the symbolism of immigrant nations, nor with reference to the economics of migration societies, have had stable answers. So for me, populism is the offspring of also the failure of the center parties that could occupy a middle ground and have failed to do so in many ways. But then still, I would maintain that even in a country like the Netherlands, where the fierce criticism of Islam by a politician like Geert Wilders has exactly produced, and the debate of the last decade has produced an enormous involvement of migrant communities in our political life. I don't think there are many societies in Western Europe where so many people with a migrant background have entered parliament. The mayor of Rotterdam, first generation Moroccan migrant. And I think, generally speaking, the conflict that we've seen in the Netherlands is a good example of how it provoked migrant communities and people with that background into public life. So in that sense, you know, even Fitna, this movie, well, let's not call it a movie, but could have been taken from a website of Al-Qaeda, most of the imagery. But that provoked in the Muslim communities a very interesting response. I went to some mosques where the film was shown, and people said, let's argue about it, you know, and there was a very mature and balanced response. So I'm not sure whether even populism and the reactions it provoked, also in the United States in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, we've seen it over and over again, movements against immigration leading to mobilization of migrant communities, people with a migrant background. I think that is the core of a living democracy. And so in that sense, I really think that on the basis of a reading of migrant immigration history, either in America or in Europe, that the proposition could be defended that conflict is in the end a sign of integration and not the failure of integration. Let me be very brief because all these questions, of course, whether it's not a euphemism, of course, I can see the difference. But what I'm trying to do is to find words that are different from the words like xenophobia, or to try to have at least the same empathy in which people who are studying migration, the same empathy they have developed, you know, for understanding the life stories of immigrants, but I can't find any sign of even the beginning of the same empathy for the position and the experiences of native populations. And that is not only a normative question, but also a question, how do you study it? What is the approach? And that is why I say that also part of native population, and you're right to say there's a generational experience at work as well. But yes, the feeling of change, and change not perceived as enrichment, first of all, but as a sense of loss, I think it is a way to approach it, but not to imply that people who see their neighborhood change, that they have migrated. No, I think it's a more existential reality. Migration has more of an impact in the life of migrants than for the natives, but still something is changing in cities where in 30, 40 years' time now half of the population are migrant families. If you look at the schools in Amsterdam, 2/3 of school-going children in Amsterdam now have a migrant background. That is quite a substantial change, not only from the perspective of migrants, but also for native population. And I think we ought to study it far more dispassionate, if you want, far more to try to understand what is at work on that side of the equation. If I look at accommodation, it's not to imply that the division of natives and newcomers will reproduce. On the contrary, I see accommodation in the end also that ethnicity loses its relevance and religion not. So I'll come to the question about religion, but I think ethnicity will lose some of its salience, will lose over generations, become less and less a relevant explanation of the life stories of those, you know, the grandchildren of migrants. So yes, there is a generational perspective at work there. And that is why I think multiculturalism is not, in an empirical sense, let alone in a normative sense, but in an empirical sense, not the right way to look at our societies, because it's a conservative idea that basically denies the change that is implied in migration history, and basically says that the traditions and the cultures of the first generation are reproduced from one generation to the other, where I think all research indicates basically the opposite, that we don't see the retention of culture in that sense. But of religion, yes, so I think we could characterize our societies as multi-religious. But the Netherlands is exactly a very good example of that the pluralism of religions didn't lead to civil war for a very long time. So the strategy to pacify relations by acceptance of a common framework of, for example, the pacification of religious education and non-religious education. So there are several ways, and I maintain simply that you cannot live with the freedoms of an open society if there are not majorities, and that is of course the hidden assumption of liberalism, if there are not majorities accepting beyond the rule of law a sense of reciprocity, of shared freedoms, that the freedom to exercise a religion, to worship, is indivisibly linked to the freedom to criticize a religion. And I think we really would have a problem in our societies, and I don't see why over generations, and I see that at work, that also many within the Muslim communities are, given their background in societies that were almost exclusively Muslim, are now thinking and redefining and reflecting upon what does it mean to be a religious minority in a society where you have religious pluralism. And I see it at work. And I think the fatalism, which would say Islam would always remain an alien element in a continent that is defined mostly by Christianity, I don't think there's much ground to say that we will live with religious division that will spill over into violent conflict. There's not that much violent conflict anyway surrounding these religious differences. There's alienation, there's prejudice on all sides, but not that much violent conflict, actually. I'll leave it there because it's, I know that I can't do justice to everybody.
There will also be an occasion to continue over drinks on the lower loggia. But before we go there, I've seen two more hands raised, and maybe we can have these as quick questions. This was Laila Hajabdu, and is there a microphone around still? And then Delphine.
Yes, I have just two short questions. Hi.
Yeah.
The one concerns the issue about what we're discussing now about the change, and just wondered what would change if you change also your perspective, namely that also, like Rainer was pointing out, that change is inevitable anyway and happens without or with migrants, and also if you see migration not as something exceptional, but more as a conditio humana, which always happened, and see more as the exception a homogeneous nation state whatsoever. So I just wondered how then the answers would look like. And the second little comment is about the just, especially when you mentioned your narrative of segregation. I just missed a bit an intersectional perspective, the dynamics of intersecting categories which are at work. So in order, how would you, maybe there would be another story if you acknowledge also these dynamics and see migrant not so much as a monolithic issue, but also take into account the class issue. For instance, just how would this change also then this narrative of segregation and others? Yeah.
Thank you. Delphine Perrin from the MPC. I have a question about maybe your methodology and your targets, the targets of your work. Because to my opinion, it seems that you compare what is not really comparable. There is so much diversity in Europe, in migration history, but you cover all Europe. Also, you compare with the US, and you seem to cover migrants in a very broad sense, newcomers, second generation, third generation, and so on. So, what is your field? What is your material to have these conclusions? And just a detail on one of your conclusions about reciprocity, for example. As a French, I don't agree with what you said. For example, about the knowledge that applicants to the citizenship would have of the receiving country. In France, the applicants to the citizenship do it in an average after 15 years in the country, and they have a very good knowledge of the country in which they live. So just an example to say that for so many things we could just say, but no, in this country it's not the same. For this category of migrants it's not applicable and so on. So how do you deal with all this and what is your field?
Yes, I mean the problem is of course, to what extent can you generalize? I mean when Hirschman is writing about access, voice, loyalty or any social theory, any approach is based on generalization. So of course, if I, and I do it in the book, if I write about what happened to the Italian migrants around 1819 in Chicago, it's a different story from perhaps what happened in New York. So if I write about Turkish migrants in Germany, the Turkish migrants of Cologne are different from Berlin. So of course you can differentiate to the extent you want. The question is, of course, can you make some generalizations that shed some light, with all modesty and all, bring some knowledge or add something to the overall idea of how migration develops. I look upon it as a human reality, and I think there are some things to be said about the human experience of migration from the point of view of migrants and receiving societies in our part of the world, where you can make some comparisons. My material draws specifically upon the comparison of European migrants in the United States and non-Western, so to say, migrants, you know, in Western Europe after the war. I think that comparison broadly brings into light some continuities, some differences, and that is what I mainly try to do. But I still think, for example, this cycle of avoidance, conflict, accommodation helps to understand something. I mean, definitely not to be applied. I could tell you a long story about Chinese migrants in the Netherlands, where after 5 generations, there's still very much a culture of avoidance, very much segregated lives. So of course, it's not a law, but I still think this dialectic sheds some light on migration histories. Now, about enrichment, that was also a question earlier asked, and perhaps that's a good way to conclude, because I emphasize that I see the enrichment of migration not so much in saying it's so interesting to have in the Netherlands now or in France, you know, Turkish culture. And then I always ask, you know, what are we talking about? And it always begins and ends most of the time in the kitchen. And which is not a bad thing in itself, but I think it's a somewhat poor understanding of the riches cultures bring with them. But if you ask, you know, if I talk in a room full of children born in families with Turkish background, and I ask them about the Turkish literature or Turkish music, you know, you don't get very far. Perhaps they're more fond of 50 Cent than of Sezen Aksu. I like Sezen Aksu, by the way, more than 50 Cent, but that's a different proposition. But so we should always ask, what is then the cultural riches that migrants bring with them? To be far more, have a critical perspective. Yes, I can see an enormous, interesting literature arising, not so much out of Turkish culture, but out of the experience of Turkish migrants in Europe, which is not saying to reproduce Turkish culture, but that something new emerges. That is a great riches. I cannot imagine British literature without those voices, Dutch literature without those voices. And I wouldn't want to put them aside as saying this is world literature. No, I think the idea is to open the idea of British literature, of French literature, to those new voices. And that is my contention about, or idea about immigrant nations, that in the end it's about the enlargement of the imagined community. I take the idea of the imagined community with all the symbolism that it entails quite seriously. And that is why I think the role of writers, musicians, artists, generally speaking, is quite important. But enlarging the imagined community means that there is an imagined community that is relevant, that there are notions of citizenship that are linked to ideas about nationality that are still relevant. And to answer the question about homogeneous nations, I don't think there are. Perhaps Iceland once, but even that. I don't think if you go back to in history that you will find much examples of nations that have developed in isolation. The story of the Netherlands, I mean, the 17th century, Amsterdam already, half of its population were immigrants. So it doesn't make much sense to speak about a Dutch history as a history that developed in isolation. No, it was a continuous, and of course with the colonial possessions, it reached far beyond the European direct context. So in that sense, it wouldn't make much, it doesn't have much meaning to speak about the history of those nations as homogeneous. But it does make a difference to acknowledge that post-war immigration was not continuous. I mean, to take the example of the Netherlands, we didn't have much immigration in the 19th century. In the 17th century, yes. In the first half of the 18th century, yes. But in the second half of the 18th century, 19th century, and in the first half of the 20th century, not much. So the impact of post-war migration is, I think, quite substantial and cannot be relativized easily by saying migration is the condition humaine. No, it is, of course, we've seen throughout history a lot of border crossing, but I still think that the impact of post-war migration, especially the last 30 years, is substantial, and that explains why it has produced so much conflict, why it is such an existential question. But I have no doubt, and perhaps that's a linear way of explaining history, but I haven't found one example, to be honest, that migration divides a society in the long run. So it might be a story that points in one direction, but I would be curious to hear one example of migrant communities that have divided and been a source of conflict over generations. I think sooner or later you would find forms of accommodation. But here comes the example, and not the Jewish community. Okay. So?
It's actually because I had a question and it relates to the question, so I just say the question as well, if I may. Because I have this, one of the core issues that you addressed was the native population or native group or whatever, native, let's say. And then the example, actually, I also put some examples to sort of confront this point of view, and this is an example of a population that creates conflict. You have Baltic states, you have the context of the Second World War, you have Russians coming to the Baltic states and occupying these territories in the 39. You can discuss the context, but still I'm a Russian, so I can use the word occupy.
Yeah, but colonization and migration are different stories.
That was a migration, because people migrated after all. First you had occupation, and then you had migration of people who came in the 40s and 50s. They stayed, now you have their grandchildren living there, and those grandchildren are treated as migrants, and they even have passports of non-citizens. How would you treat this situation, and how would you ascribe it in the context of a native, and whom would you define as a native? And I could give you many other examples on that. Thank you.
Okay.
There are
but
many
that is
more examples. I could think of 5 others, but
no, but you should make a difference between national minorities Like, you know, I've been a correspondent in Poland, so I have some idea about Central European history. And like Wil Kimlicka is doing, there is really a difference between national minorities and migrant communities. And, well, we could speak a long time about it, but that's one thing. The other thing is that, of course, the context of domination, and for example, incorporation of states is quite a different experience from the story of migration I'm speaking about. So, but I would be really astonished if that division you're talking about would reproduce itself the next 2 or 3 generations, if this conflict would have been not solved in the longer run, if there would not be found one form of accommodation, if the memories of those who have been living with the occupation, because I would call it an occupation, if those memories are not fading away, etc. So that's an open question, but I think the context is quite different, so I maintain the proposition that it would be hard to find an example of migrant communities of the sort I've been speaking about that have divided societies for over generations. I think you would be hard-pressed to find those examples. That would be my last word.
Okay, can I use this to thank Paul Scheffer very much for an extremely stimulating talk. The best test for this is that it's so hard to conclude it. Any attempt to say something that concludes leads to a new challenge. But let me remind you that quite some